Okay, Ryan, I'm glad I looked at the answer sheet because kind of what I was concerned with was the case. This title, this figure misled me when we first looked at this, and I apologize. This title right here I thought only applied to the top bar graph, this one. It actually applies to both. So I was misled. So that makes things pretty easy because the question here asks, if in the United States in 1995 there were 100 million employed adults and 40 million adults not in the labor force, and approximately what was the ratio of number of employed adults participating in adult education to the number of people not in the labor force participating in adult education? That's this section right here. Then this is a pretty simple ratio. We just have to set up employed, educated, or in education to not in labor force. Alright, so this now we can set up this question pretty easy because we know that this title right here applies to this bar graph also. Okay, so in other words, we can do some very simple math now because we can calculate employed, because this table right here in the bottom tells us what percent in 1995, it's the lighter color, are employed. And so we can calculate this number by simply taking 100 million that they give us here times 50% as a decimal, which is 0.5. So that's just going to be 50 million. And then we can, so that gets us this top part. And now let's find this bottom part. Not in the labor force, they give us 40 million. So that's this part here times, well, this is the not in labor force portion. Again, in 1995 is 20%. So 0.2 as a decimal equals 8 million. So now we've gotten both the top ratio number and the bottom ratio number. So now we just set it up. 50 to 8, and this is millions. But you need to reduce that. So the way they recommend in the back of the book, and in terms of this problem it works, it doesn't give you an exact answer but a close enough answer, is just dividing, because usually I'd recommend just dividing them until you get them reduced to the lowest form. In this case, they just divide the top by the bottom number, right? So divide it, both of them, by 8. Top and the bottom by 8. So 50 divided by 8 is just 6.25. And 8 here, clearly, divided by 8 is just 1. So your final ratio of employed and educated in participating education, not in labor force participating in education, is 6.25 to 1, which is closest to answer E down here. So that one's actually simple. I think what misled me was I presumed this was a separate graph. Now, just as a side note, I did the research and these percentages line up because there's 3 pools. So as a separate piece of information, because we were looking at this when we were originally talking about it, how do you get this percent right here of employed? Well, that percent, this is separate from this information, so you can pause it here if you want for a second. That percent is derived from number employed over the total population, which is 3 separate groups: employed, unemployed, and not in the labor force. So employed we know is 100 million, right? Okay. Plus unemployed we don't know, right? We can make that our X. Unemployed. And then finally, not in labor force, which is 40 million. So setting this all up, Now it's just a standard ratio, and that's how they get these three separate percentages that don't add up to 100, because you have three separate groups. So it's a little different than ratios that I exposed you to in the past, but I wanted to make sure and explain how they got that. So for example, this all is going to equal 50% for 1995, or 0.5. So rewriting this, again, this 100 million is employed, so this becomes 100 million on top, 100 million here. We don't know the unemployed, we do know the not employed. So it's 100 million over 100 million plus X plus 40 million equals 0.5. Well, that can be simplified, right, to be 100 million over 140 million, because I just added these two, plus X equals 0.5. Now you can cross multiply and distribute if you want to practice, but I'm going to simplify for the purposes of the video here. Essentially, what number could I add to this that would cause this to be 0.5 over here? Well, if I add 60 million here, then I'm going to get 100 million over 200 million, which gets me 0.5. So we know 60 million is the unemployed. So that's kind of how they get all these different numbers and figures. Now there is some erroneous information on this, but that's some of how they do this. So I wanted to help you out with that. Alright.